Good. Well, welcome everyone to our Luminous Mind Sangha first Thursday gathering. And I wanted to introduce the folks from our team that are here, which are Jeannie, who is our Zoom host. And thank you so much, Jeannie, for your volunteering to help us with this. And tonight, Marisa is going to be our featured guest and content provider as a trauma therapist, as a licensed trauma therapist. So I'll get into that in a little bit after we do the meditation. But tonight we'll be talking about trauma therapy and how trauma therapy and meditation intersect. So Marisa will be sharing some of her experience both as a trauma therapist and as a meditator, which is kind of a unique perspective. And I want to, before we get into the talk, introduce Henry Garcia, who's also on the Luminous Mind Sangha team as a teacher in training. And he'll be giving a talk later this year in the fall. And he is a scientist, physicist who works with Pixar Animation and is also a dad and a husband. And nice to see you, Henry. Yeah. And I, in particular, want to also welcome Marisa's loved ones. So it's wonderful to have you all here and having you joining us. So this talk is something Marisa and I have been talking about for like years. So we're really excited to be doing it and sharing this really important topic with you all as practitioners, because it doesn't get talked about that much, and it is really significant. And as a teacher, I've seen how important it is, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But just to sort of orient you to Marisa, and her bio is on the Luminous Mind Sangha website. She's an affiliated professional with Luminous Mind Sangha. And at one point, she's been a student of mine for many years. And at one point was going to be a teacher in training before she was fully functioning in her licensed trauma therapist role. And then when she started doing that, she realized how much she loved doing it and that it really was her calling. But we still have her as part of our team as an affiliated professional. It's wonderful for us because we have a licensed trauma therapist on our team, and this is great for us as teachers to have her. So, she'll be weaving in and out periodically with talks as we see what is most helpful to people. And she's a very deep practitioner, also very deep practitioner. One of the deepest practitioners I know, actually. So she has both of these threads weaving through her life and has completed advanced trauma therapist training and with one of the most well-respected institutes in the world, I think, for trauma therapy. So, she really has a very deep experience in both parts of what we'll be talking about tonight. So, and, just personally for me, I'm really excited about this because now that I've been a teacher for almost 20 years, I've seen a lot of students who have trauma, and I've learned more and more about how to help as a teacher, which, the best way that I can help is to encourage them to see a trauma therapist. But there are things we can do in the meditation practice also that can be more skillful in working with trauma if it's arising for ourselves. And I also have done trauma therapy myself. And it was really beneficial. So I think that's all I want to say for the introduction. Marisa, it's over to you.
Thank you very much, Tina. Yeah.
And I should just say, we're going to be doing this. Mostly Marisa's going to be sharing from her experience, but we are going to have, I have some questions for her that I'll be asking throughout the talk as we go back and forth.
And I want to start by just saying thank you to everyone for being here. I'm thrilled to have this opportunity. And I would like to just offer some welcoming remarks and an orientation to this session. First and foremost, a friendly reminder to really take care of yourself during this talk. I will be discussing the sensitive topic of trauma. I'll also be really diving into trauma healing and what that actually looks like. But if you notice yourself feeling activated at any point during this, I invite you to, ground yourself, take a break from the screen, maybe feel the soles of your feet on the ground. But just wanted to mention that up front. And to provide an orientation, I really aim to cover three main questions in this session. What is trauma? How do we define it? I'll share about how I'm understanding it. And then I'll talk about what trauma therapy is and how it's different from talk therapy. And then I will be touching on really what meditation practitioners can do when they notice upsetting or overwhelming or traumatic material arising inside of their practice. And really here I will be weaving in the work of trauma professional David Trelevin, educator and the author of Trauma Sensitive Mindfulness, so that everyone has really concrete tools to work with inside of practice. And really, before I dive in, I'd also like to just share that what I'll be really discussing tonight comes from my experiences as a clinician, as someone who has been in therapy, as a meditation practitioner, and really all of the principles, the concepts, the modalities that I'll be speaking to all come from experts in the fields, people who have dedicated their lives to uncovering what effective healing looks like. And it has been a tremendous privilege to learn from them and to receive training from them. So I will be drawing on their wisdom in this talk. And at the end, I will be sharing resources in the chat if you would like to learn more.
And we'll also have time for questions, just to say that. I forgot to mention that.
Absolutely. And I think before I want to define trauma, I want to begin with a quote from author and teacher Thomas Hübl. This comes from his book, Attuned, which I also recommend. And he said, there is an evolutionary intelligence inherent in our responses to great adversity that makes it possible to survive, adapt, and transform even the worst of our suffering. And with care and patience, presence, and attunement, we can utilize what we learn from trauma to repair ourselves and the broken connections between us. And I offer this quote really to frame the conversation today, really because of this word transform that's used. And I want to highlight that, as he says, we can transform even the worst of our suffering. And I will be really speaking to how the path of meditation and trauma-focused therapy really support one another.
Yeah, and both of those books are excellent. I've read them, and if any of you are interested, I can, really endorse them. So, Marisa, how do you understand trauma? I mean, what would you give us to, help understand if we have trauma, and how do we tease apart, trauma from just difficult experiences? How would you define it?
Mm. Yeah, so I I would like to start with two definitions and then really go into how I'm thinking about it. I think the place to start is the American Psychiatric Association's Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, which is now in its fifth edition. Really, what they say trauma is the exposure to actual or threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violation by either directly witnessing the events, um, or witnessing in person the events as it occurs to others, directly experiencing the events, or learning that the events have occurred to a close family member or a close friend. So just to kind of frame that, this is really the authoritative guide on mental health diagnoses. So to bring in that definition, but I'd also like to bring in a definition from the Center for Healthcare Strategies, which says trauma is a pervasive problem. It results from exposure to an incident or series of events that are emotionally disturbing or life-threatening, with lasting adverse effects on one's functioning and mental, physical, emotional, and spiritual well-being. So I want to go into this a little bit more here now that we have those definitions. But really the way that I'm thinking about trauma is that when we have an experience that is simply too overwhelming to bear and to process in the moment of occurrence, we are not able to metabolize it. And so we really are not safe to be in the present moment. And so what ends up happening is that psychological wounds can then remain because the experience is too much to process. It's as if it can get stuck inside, and these wounds will hold the raw, unprocessed emotions, the physical sensations, maybe negative beliefs about ourselves, about the world. And then this can almost like create a blueprint that can influence and inform the present moment experience, right? So now the unintegrated material from the past event is alive in the present moment. So how does that actually then play out? How does it present itself? Trauma presents itself in the form of exaggerated reactions to the present moment that are disproportionate to what is actually occurring, right? So really with trauma, we're not responding to the present moment, but actually reacting based on the past. So maybe I'll just give an example of like a triggered reaction, just to frame this a little bit more here. So let's say you receive critical feedback from your boss, and now you are ruminating For days and days, you're, let's say, withdrawing from colleagues, you're no longer speaking up in work meetings. Now, that I'm guessing that critical feedback would bother anyone, but if it hits the wounds of childhood experiences of maybe having an emotionally abusive or overly critical caretaker, it ends up creating then an outsized response to the present moment experience, right? So really, I'm seeing trauma as maybe fragmentation or disconnection, right? And healing is really integration, reconnecting with the parts of us that have been pushed away and that have become frozen. There's so much I could also, continue to say here about what this is. But I also just want to touch a little bit on prevalence, right? So before I even bring in any statistics here, I really see trauma as an ocean that surrounds us. I mean, it's really, it's in the air that we breathe. It spans many different levels, including at the attachment level, at birth, and in the earliest years, at the interpersonal level, at the institutional and systemic level, and at the global level. And the global collaboration on traumatic stress states that approximately 70% of the world's population has been exposed to a traumatic life event. And it goes on to say that the resulting mental health problems represent a major challenge to public mental health services globally. And then in the United States, this is based on a systematic literature review published in 2021. It reports that in the United States, it's estimated that 80% of the population will be exposed to a traumatic event at some point. And just to sort of reground all of us here, I again want to circle back to the quote from Thomas Hübl about transformation, right? Um,
Can I jump in with something, Marisa?
yes, please.
I heard either a quote or maybe I actually heard the Dalai Lama like in a recording saying this, but he feels that trauma is the number one blockage to spiritual awakening. So, I don't think the Dalai Lama would have said that 30 years ago before we had this understanding through research that you're talking about, but he actually sees that in working with people also that, he now is saying that he feels it's the number one block to basically deepening on our spiritual path.
Mm-hmm. I
Yeah.
can really understand that.
Yeah.
And many experts have shared that trauma is one of the most pervasive and pressing public health issues of our time because of the residual effects and the implications on physical health, on brain development in children, on spiritual health. Yeah. So I am eager, though, to really dive into the healing journey, the healing process. But it feels very important to also bring in, as I discuss the prevalence of trauma, the recognition of social context when thinking about trauma and the larger social conditions that surround us. So I would like to quote David Trelevin, again, the author of Trauma Sensitive Mindfulness. And he shares the following. It goes without saying that trauma can affect anyone, regardless of what groups they belong to. But research tells us that people in marginalized social groups face conditions that make them more vulnerable to experience traumatic events. Again, while traumatic events can happen to anyone, anywhere, at any time, social context will always be a component.
Yeah. So, did you have more to say on that, Marisa, or you know? Yeah. So, this brings us to a good point of really, understanding what is trauma therapy then, and how is it different from talk therapy? That's probably the most common kind that, a lot of people nowadays have experienced. How is it different? I think one of the things I hear from people a lot is that when I suggest they do trauma therapy, I've actually had this happen where people say, oh yeah, I have a therapist. And that's wonderful. I'm a huge supporter of people doing therapy as a companion to spiritual practice, because the technologies that we have on the spiritual path, we don't have the technologies that have been discovered, invented, in the last 100 years with psychology. So I think having both is really optimal for a person's unfoldment. But a lot of times people will think their regular therapist is a trauma therapist. So, I think this is where understanding, are there differences? And if so, what are they? And what's important about knowing that.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, and thank you for those points. I do really want to talk about both and how I see them, talk therapy and trauma therapy, as really part of the same arc of healing. And I'll explain why. There are many different kinds of therapy modalities. There are cognitive behavioral therapies, there are somatic therapies, psychodynamic, skills-based, neurobiologically informed therapies. So many people actually will engage in talk therapy before coming to see me and doing trauma-focused work. And I also welcome the opportunity to provide adjunct EMDR in the case where folks have a primary therapist, they come and work with me really for the trauma therapy, and then they go back to integrate the work with their primary therapist, right? So it can absolutely be done that way. And of course, I then welcome the opportunity to consult with the primary therapist with the client's permission. But there are many benefits to both. So benefits to talk therapy, supportive, again, that's the skill building, supporting folks in developing self-regulation skills, building insight, right? Having a space to feel heard and seen. And the way that I think about trauma therapy, really the two cornerstones are that it is structured and it is done in a phase model. So I really want to highlight that trauma therapy does need to go in phases. We do not just jump right in to really difficult memories. There are many phases to support clients in establishing stability, learning ways to support the regulation of their nervous systems. I offer psychoeducation which is really a key intervention within trauma therapy, which is really educating the client about what trauma is, the effects of trauma, and really empowering the client with information. So psychoeducation is a key phase to trauma therapy, alongside resourcing, and again, building skills to have affect tolerance, really the ability to tolerate then strong, intense affect or emotional states. And then once the preparation phase and the resourcing phase has been done, and again, every therapy, whether it's a talk therapy or a trauma therapy, absolutely needs to be, tailored to the unique needs of the client, their strengths, their challenges. So of course, every phase of trauma therapy is tailored uniquely to the client. But really, once we've gone through those beginning phases, we then move into the memory reprocessing phase, right? This is really the opportunity to, I would say, with a lot of gentleness, start to work carefully and in a titrated way with traumatic memories. And what I really want to point out about this phase, because there are several modalities that can be brought in here, we're really allowing the brain and the nervous system to tap into its natural healing capacities. So talking is not required when we are doing memory reprocessing. I mean, I will check in and be sort of carefully monitoring the reprocessing, but again, it's really the brain doing the healing work, and I tell all of my clients that. And with this phase of memory reprocessing, this is where EMDR comes in. EMDR is widely researched. It stands for eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. It was developed in the late 1980s and has been endorsed by the World Health Organization. This is a modality that I am trained in, and I could really give a whole talk just on EMDR. It's a very comprehensive 8-phase therapy. But again, within EMDR is the memory reprocessing phase. So the last phase then of trauma therapy is the integration phase, right? Because we're working directly with traumatic material, we're really supporting that material to move through, to be digested very gradually. Again, we don't want there to be flooding or re-traumatization. So again, this is a very titrated process so that, again, the material can be healed. We then want to integrate that, integrate the insights, integrate the shifts in beliefs, really integrate the experience of now having those memories no longer hold the same emotional charge. I can just speak to my experiences within EMDR. It doesn't erase the memories, but what it does is it helps to neutralize the valence, the intensity. It's like, oh, now I can think back to that memory, still there, but it feels distant. It really now feels in the past. it doesn't hold the same sort of gut punch reaction that it did prior to the trauma therapy. Um, so that's how I'm seeing the overarching phases of trauma therapy. Again, there is so much I can say here, and I'm sure I'm missing pieces, but that is how I'm seeing it. And then the last thing I'll say is that it's different from talk therapy in the sense that people don't have to talk about the memories in detail to heal them.
Mm.
Right.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And, I think that would be an appealing part of it too. Um, and this is where, there's ways that spiritual practice does this, maybe not at the level of trauma, or maybe sometimes, I mean, again, in my own case, I can see where we're both um, technologies, if you want to see meditation and spiritual technologies as one set that have been around for thousands of years. And then we have therapeutic, psychological technologies that we are just now, and especially the trauma therapies have been fairly recent. It hasn't been that long. And what a miracle that we now have that. Um, and this is part of what the benefit of spiritual practices is that charge gets lessened and lessened to where we can have equanimity in more and more situations. So, in this way, I see there being a beautiful, flow that can happen between these two amazing technologies. Yeah. So, what would you suggest then for meditators who might, touch into something like this when they're practicing, and especially where I see it the most is on longer retreats. And this is why people really need to work up to doing longer retreats, start with a daily practice, then do a day long, do a weekend, do a 5 day, do a 1 week, before, like on my 2 week, I now have a whole psychological screening because it's important. It's important that people are, practicing at the right level for what they their capacity is. And so what advice would you give if people encounter something like that in their practice?
Mhm. Yeah, and I'm really glad that we're touching into this. This feels just really important, just given what I shared about the prevalence of trauma.
Right.
And really, hey, maybe I'll just start with just a personal example here. When I was on a long retreat, I was just hit by something that really was a collective trauma. And I could not sit still. I could not continue practicing eyes closed, sitting still. And I was not in the meditation hall, but I ended up just getting up, going outside, really sort of taking in nature as a resource and opening. I mean, I would say that opening my eyes and shifting postures, standing up are all are really important modifications that people can use. And I just wanted to share how I brought those in. But David Trelevin talks a lot about the ways in which when we are paying sustained attention to our inner atmosphere, that this can actually really exacerbate traumatic material when we're really in close contact, and especially on long retreat where you're in practice for so many hours. He does talk about the possibility of re-triggering traumatic states inside of practice. And so that is why he offers these modifications. And I do again recommend his book because it lays out many that you can then explore and see which ones are most helpful to you. So he provided the two that I already spoke about, saying it's okay to open your eyes. right? It's okay to like come back into right here, right now, right? He also talks, yeah, about shifting postures. Maybe you do need to stand up. Maybe you do need to bring some movement in to let the intensity of the emotional states move through. And then he also offered two more modifications here. He talks about the modification of slow, deep belly breaths. And Tina, you're nodding. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Those are things like, one of the things that I really have made sure to institute on all of my retreats is the option to stand up. This is one of the postures the Buddha gave us with standing meditation. So to do it quietly where you're not disturbing your neighbors, but this can be another use for the standing meditation is if you're, if you're becoming triggered with trauma, just having that break. And also, I like if I'm working with somebody one-on-one and they're in a session, and I can tell they're having some trauma material, I'll tell them, open your eyes and just look around the room and see that you're in a safe place where you are here right now. Look at your body, and that way you're knowing that you are actually in a safe place, even though these feelings are arising. And the belly breaths, there's so much physiologically. I learned this when I was working in healthcare, that just taking 3 deep belly breaths will actually change your physiology in measurable ways. So, I mean, we're meditating, so it's pretty easy to take 3 deep breaths, and it actually starts de-escalating that, more reptilian brain that is just reacting out of instinctual self-preservation. Yeah, yeah. So, I mean, and I feel like that's helped a lot on my retreats. The fact that people know they can do these things really is a way of titrating. I love that about the trauma therapy. You resource yourself in a place that there's strength and capacity, and then you can go back into the trauma, preferably with a trauma therapist. But if you're working it on your own, you can just touch in a little. You don't want to swamp yourself to where it's overwhelming. Yeah. And this is why we have also the 4 categories of meditation, is that, say somebody's doing Vipassana and they're really exploring what's arising as trauma. Well, maybe don't keep doing Vipassana. Do some samatha, come to the breath, or do some loving kindness to resource yourself. So, this is part of why now every time I teach on a longer retreat, I at least mention all 4 categories of practice so that people can use the other categories as resources to help them if they get into difficult material.
Exactly.
Yeah, yeah. Thanks for those. Tips. So I want to make sure we have at least a little time for questions. Was there anything else you wanted to say on that before we open it up?
I would like to offer some concluding remarks.
Sure. Yeah.
Again, we covered a lot of ground in a short amount of time. But really just the last point I want to make is the way in which the path of meditation and the path of trauma therapy complement one another. Right. So again, exactly as you're speaking to, Tina, right? Meditation is really at the heart of it a learning. It's a learning how to be with things as they are, our inner atmosphere as it is, right? Learning to stay with things as they are. And the place for trauma therapy is really that sometimes things are just too overwhelming to be with, to sit with, to stay with. And trauma therapy again opens up a safe container to again, gently bring up material and process it through in a manageable way. So it's really as if it's two sides of the same coin. And it is such a pivotal time to be in the fields of therapy. I know there are several therapists in the room, but I am very excited to see how the field unfolds, where it goes from here. We have so many powerful modalities that offer real transformation. I sit with trauma every day, and yet I love what I do because I get to witness such deep levels of transformation because of the trauma modalities that are now available.
Yeah, it is exciting, and it's exciting for spiritual practitioners too, because we actually have, specific technologies that are designed to more rapidly work with the trauma and to work with it safely. So I'm excited to see what happens too. Yeah.
Yeah.
Good. So we have just a few minutes for questions if anybody has anything for Marisa or me, but especially for Marisa. Yes, Jay.
In the hope, I mean, you kind of bring up a lot of, a lot of the processes, and, you kind of going, whoever's a person that's going through that, including myself, there's the part of the childhood where you kind of think you got everything, you know enough, right? You know enough to see how it affected you, how it feels, really what happened. I don't need to know more. But when you're trying, you're trying to recapture those lost year at child, like what happened, why is that? And you're beginning to uncover it. I agree. You got these four kind of types of meditation I'm learning to use, like delicate brain surgery, really. I mean, you're not trying to overload, flood yourself. You're trying to love yourself. But as you're trying to get to the finish line, so to speak, and you're talking about, I'm really curious about, I have a therapist who's very, very skilled therapist, but she's not trained in trauma. I got the resource. I think I got some wonderful resources for meditation. But how do you, and that the stuff is dragging you down. I mean, you can't kind of walk through life and say, I don't need to deal with that, because you're probably, in my case, I was ignoring, I'm ignoring the triggers. I'm ignoring the fact that I can't really kind of grow into this authentic person who can have a real relationship with somebody, for instance. But anyway, getting back to, I'm kind of curious about, is EMDR kind of would be an example of something that's a little bit more specialized that can kind of get you to the finish line of all this, kind of for somebody like me.
Mm-hmm. No,
and I think I'm pretty good as it is, but I'm just one of these people that wants to train for the marathon and finish it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I appreciate the question here, and I'm happy to speak to EMDR, and I'll be offering a link in the chat for the EMDR International Association, where you can read more about each phase. So EMDR is very comprehensive. It often actually interweaves other therapy modalities. It can often have a somatic component. It can have a polyvagal component. So again, an understanding of the nervous system. And it can go very deeply into stored material. right? Again, there are several phases to go through, so it is, it's important to, find a therapist with whom you feel comfortable to do the work. But it does bring up strong emotional states. But as it brings them up, because they have a chance to arise, they then often dissipate, and the material becomes integrated into the past. And I do recommend looking into it. Everyone's brain processes differently, but I have been utterly amazed by the effects of EMDR, the really tangible shifts that can happen in terms of beliefs that people hold, right? People may hold beliefs about themselves. It was my fault. I'm not worthy. I'm unlovable. Really core, these are called core cognitions, and EMDR really targets those. EMDR, again, it's comprehensive, so it's looking at emotional states, beliefs, physical sensations, and it's working with all of that and allowing your brain the time, the space, the conditions to go in and do the healing work. And again, those shifts can then really take place in terms of our beliefs about ourselves, and like I mentioned in the talk, the emotional charge also dissipates. So
I will
I,
just add, I'll be going to Tina's July retreat with how much loving kindness. I mean, and I think Tina at the previous retreat just really harped on that, especially when I get in that dysregulated kind of thing, how much that helps. This is just me sharing with other folks, and one thing that wasn't hit on is group therapy. I have a group therapy I go to, and that too helps process. I think for me, figuring out what to process, and that's not a follow-up question. I'm just trying to learn other things too. So thank you.
Yeah, and the EMDR, I'll just say that Marisa has worked with people with extremely severe trauma and complicated trauma. So, when she and I talked about her being part of our team as an adjunct, the people, normally people who are on a spiritual path, there's Maslow's hierarchy, and they have to be at least somewhat high enough to be interested in something like self-actualization or personal growth. But, I've heard her, talk about how amazing it is, even for people with really severe trauma, the EMDR and there's other modalities that she also knows, but I mean, it sounds really miraculous to me. And this is where either if you have, locally, if you want to find somebody you work with ongoing, Marisa's only licensed in a few states. So unfortunately, like my hope was that we could refer people to her and she could do it by Zoom, but licensing doesn't allow that. But she is doing short retreats where people will come to where she's at and then do like a few days or a day or half a day where it's a little more intensive. And so that is also, that's how she did it when she worked with the Trauma Institute. People would come for longer periods and do more of a retreat type format. So, we haven't made a handoff yet, but this is kind of the first time she's come out into our community. And, I'm really eager to see when you do that with somebody that is a meditator, how does it go? So, we can learn a lot from that too. Yeah. Thanks for the question, Jay. Oh, did you have more, Marisa?
Maybe just the last point, very brief here, is that there are, in addition to EMDR, there are a few other memory reprocessing techniques. So I actually have everyone test out all three so that they can experience it directly and then really figure out for themselves which modalities they like best. So that's also part of the sort of educating people about, these modalities. Yeah, so.
Good. Well, we're just about out of time. one of the things we've been doing the last several months, or at least offering, is the option for people who would like to have some Sangha time with other, folks who are here, to go into a breakout group. And with this being the topic, we wanted to pick a question that was not invasive or personal. We don't want people getting into their trauma issues, but just, how is it landing? So the question we were proposing was, how is what Marisa has shared landing with you? And what we've been doing, if people wanted to, is to go into a group of 3 where for 10 minutes, where you would each have a little bit of time to share about that, and then come back to the larger group. So is anyone, if you're interested in that, please raise your hand, because I don't, we only do it if we have enough people who are interested in it. Okay, so Robin would. Anybody else? Michael would. Okay, if we have one more person, then we have a triad. Jay, are you saying yes? Okay, so the 3 of you will, in a minute, Jeannie will set it up where you can go into a small group. But any closing comments, Marisa, for everyone else who will be dropping off before we go into the breakout?
Yeah, again, I just really want to thank everyone so much for being here. I'm really grateful to have this opportunity. And the last thing I want to say is that there is so much hope within this field. And going back to really where I started, transformation is absolutely possible.
Yeah, thank you so much for being with us and for the work you do. I mean, you're really making such a huge difference in the world, and I'm just so glad that the world has you and other people like you who are doing this deeply, profoundly transformative work for people who would just suffer their whole lives otherwise. They might not have any other way to heal from the traumas that have happened. So, thank you for the work you're doing, Marisa. It's really, I admire it very much.
Thank you, Tina.
Yeah. And did you want to put something in the chat so that the people who may be dropping off could get whatever resource links you have?
Absolutely. I'll do that right now.
We'll also get that link on the website when we post this up there too, so we can add that in as well.
Yeah, so we, at some point, hopefully soon, will be posting some of, a more narrative version of what we've talked about tonight on the Luminous Mind Sangha website, so that you can, have this in a written format if you wanted to refer back to it. And the resources will be there too. But let's see, did you post what you wanted to, Marisa?
And here's the last one. Yeah.
Good. Well, thank you all for being here. And if you're dropping off, we look forward to seeing you at a future event. And for those of you who are staying, Jeannie will be putting you into the breakout group. So if you're not staying, this would be a good time to drop off. Be well.
Bye-bye.